using the ICE framework and converting that to an application studio layer. This is the majority of the technical work required to facilitate move from classic to kinetic UI. And again, if you're using Epicor in a minimally customized configuration, you probably don't have a lot to do here. However, if you're a customer who maybe was an 803 customer who upgraded to 905, who then upgraded to 10.0, 10.1, and now you're at 10.2, 500 or 700, you probably brought a lot of customization along with you. And these are the people I'm talking to now on this slide. So again, being on the latest release is critical. We had some customers who, again, were on Kinetic 2021.1 or 0.2 releases, and were trying and really struggling, even with our help, to uplift classic customizations to Kinetic UI layers. And those early releases of Kinetic, specifically the tools in Application Studio and other upgrade tools, were just not where they are today on the current release. So staying on that current release and always having that current release and update level available and deployed is critical to success here. Now, those of you who have already started to undertake this are going to understand it. There's a lot of moving parts within a screen customization, but the ones that are going to require the most effort are any client-side code. In other words, if you're using C# and link queries in C# code on the client, while that's technically possible to do in some ways in Kinetic, best practices are to take all of that code and move it out of the customization and into server-side objects, specifically either Epicor functions, which have been present since about, I think, 10.2.700. They may have even reared their head a little bit earlier than that, but moving that code to functions or to BPM method and data directives. And again, functions, method data, and data directives are all server-side code. And as if generally speaking, if it worked in 10.2.500 or 10.2.700, there's very little adjustment required on server-side code, functions and BPMs required to move from 10.2.700, for example, to Kinetic 2023.2. So the sooner you can start moving that client-side code from a customization layer into server-side code, the easier your upgrade path is going to be. One more note, and again, I have a screenshot here at the bottom of this slide, and what I'm highlighting is in the conversion workbench, under the user run conversions, there is an Epicor provided conversion. It's sequence 180 for those of you who are familiar with a conversion workbench. If you have classic customizations present, running this conversion will automatically create an application studio layer or a Kinetic UI layer that is essentially the best effort at taking your classic screen and making it work in Kinetic. Now, a few caveats. If your customization, for example, is what I would call a light to maybe moderate level customization, and specifically what might you be doing in a customization like this, you might have added a few UD fields onto, for example, the sales order detail data set. You put a few additional UD fields there, and then you wanted to expose those in the order entry screen, for example, for your users to add additional data when they're entering a sales order. I would call that probably a light to intermediate level customization. Something at that level, again, little to no client-side code in that customization. If you run this conversion program, there will be an application studio layer converted. And for example, those form fields and their bindings to the underlying UD fields will be preserved in that layer. And again, can provide a starting point for you as a developer in Application Studio to further adjust, behaviors and, kind of layout questions. But again, I encourage you to experiment with this, but this is not the easy button by any means. You can't take a complex customization containing server-side code and extensive data views and things like that, and just press this button and have it magically translate all that for you. That is not what this conversion does. Again, it provides a starting point for a developer to make that a layer available and begin customizing it for the Kinetic UI. All right, a few other tips and tricks, and then I'm going to wrap up my content here. Specifically, if you have Classic UI dashboards, it is possible in Kinetic UI to redeploy, just like you deploy a classic dashboard from the actions menu. One of the actions available on a Kinetic release is to deploy this as a Kinetic UI application. And in this case, what I've done in my two screenshots here on the left-hand side, and I know you can't see the data, but there's a simple dashboard there. The upper data grid displays a list of customers and related data from the customer table. And then the lower grid is subscribed to that with a publish and subscribe relationship, and that displays order header records related to the customer that is selected in the first data grid. Again, simple, standard publish and subscribe. On the right-hand side of my screen is that same dashboard, behaves identically, deployed in the Kinetic UI, and the only thing I did was, again, in the Classic UI, launched up dashboard maintenance, opened up my dashboard, went to the actions menu, hit deploy, chose the option to deploy to Kinetic UI, and I got a dashboard that functions equivalently. Now, there's a few things that tend not to work so easily in dashboards. And again, I'm willing to bet these are improving over time. But for example, if you use dashboards using tractor query control, where you have a tractor view and then one or more data grids, those, especially ones where you're selecting a range of values, like a start date and an end date for sales orders, those can be more difficult. And again, it won't be as simple as upgrading the dashboard with the publish and subscribe relationship that I just showed. A couple of tips for that. BAQ parameters. In other words, and if you don't know how to use BAQ parameters, you should learn, because BAQ parameters and dashboards built using BAQ parameters, for example, displaying records between a range of dates is a common use case. Using BAQ parameters is a better and more easily upgraded way to create a dashboard based on that. Also, just in general terms, do as much work as you possibly can in the BAQ, because it makes building and deploying the dashboard in Kinetic UI much easier. All right. Very briefly here, and again, I want to break and get to customizations, but again, what I've done here and displayed on this screen, and again, I don't expect you to be able to see the details, but to understand the concept of what I've done here, on the upper left, what you see is a Classic UI customization, and in this case, there's a couple of custom tabs that were added to that Classic UI customization, and you can take my word for it, but each of those tabs has a couple of dozen custom controls on it, most of which are bound to UD fields, in this case on the part table. This particular business requirement, there were a lot of attributes related to parts that didn't neatly fit into the standard Epicor fields. What I did with this, again, I imported the customization into 2023.2. I ran conversion sequence 180, and on the lower right-hand side, you see a kinetic layer that corresponds to this part customization. And you can't see it on my screen grab, but what it did do was created panel cards that replicated the functionality of those custom tabs, including the columns and bindings that were present. So again, it's not an easy button, but it does give the developer a little bit of a head start in terms of taking a classic customization to Kinetic UI. All right. I just want to mention this, and then we're going to go to Q&A. If you are a product configurator, embedded product configurator customer, and you're using product configurators, the latest releases do a pretty good job. Again, they're not magic, but they do provide a starting point. And again, what you would do is either copy or import your existing classic UI configurator. Generally speaking, by the way, your document rules and your method rules should survive this change just fine. The area of focus here is the UI layer. That is the input forms where the user gets to answer questions about, do you want small, medium, or large, red, green, or blue, etc. But again, there is a button, and I've highlighted it here, that any configurator, and this is a we can't go back thing, so don't do this in your live environment, by the way. In a test environment, maybe duplicate an existing configurator, and then there is a checkbox that says Design in Application Studio. And when you do that, what will happen is a Kinetic UI Application Studio layer will be created with all of your inputs and appropriate controls bound to those. It may not look really great, and you'll probably have some work to do to clean that up, but it does provide, again, a starting point to take a classic UI configurator and deploy it for Kinetic UI.